Okay, we're going to look at another article here on ancient Egypt and ethnicity of it and genetics and such. And this is a modernized picture or whatever drawn of it, but you can see that it's that iconography that they have quite often. And the females drawn extremely pale, whereas the males here seem to be darker. But it doesn't have to be so. Priests are quite often lighter. He is a little lighter than him in some, but yeah, and then the other females, like priestesses and things like that, are very pale, also drawn in the art. But ones that are workers and out and dancers are quite often drawn just as dark as males. And it's an odd symbology that they have that you can see goes from the Greeks and their art, where they have pale women and red ochre men, and Minoans, same coloration, very pale, but then nobility sometimes can be pale also. So it depends on the way they're trying to depict them at the time. And a pharaoh was always depicted dark as opposed to light, even though he probably wasn't going out too much and doing much working, we know. But he's depicted that way because he's a worker and he's making it happen. He's the man in action. And they've made note of this for a long, long time. And then, of course, so they're Caucasians because they have the ability to tan and do all of these things. But which one are they? And it says that they rule over the black-headed people, but then they realize that they all just shaved their heads and they wore these ceremonial little mop heads on them quite often, which Negroids try to say that that's an afro, but that's not an afro, and they show some Beja type guy and everything and admix people now, but no, that doesn't have any bearing on it. And sadly, the people that are trying to say all this are sub-Saharan West Africans that were primitives until just recently, and I think just out of the inferiority complex they have, they try to claim other societies. They go as far as say things like, well, it's in Africa, so it's got to be black, and that makes no sense whatsoever. All of North Africa was always Caucasians, and Egypt, and even through the Horn in ancient times. You look up the definition of Caucasian, and it says that, but they want to deny all of this for some fantasy type thing that they have going on. So let's just look into this article, and I want you to know this is that Caleb Strom. I've done a couple articles on him, and he's that one that likes to leave it a little vague, and it almost sounds like he knows something, but then leaves it vague many times. Analyzing mummy genes. Were ancient Egyptians closely related to Middle Easterners? So now what we're doing is we're figuring out whether or not they're closely related to Middle Easterners or perhaps the Libyan Caucasians that are still there, existed today. Are the people that are they still the same type of thing? Or are they more close related to the Amazigh and the Berbers over there in far west and Mediterranean and Morocco area and stuff that are, of course, Caucasians too. And there's a lot of black people there now in influx, but that's a much more modern thing. So which one do they connect to, or is it the Middle East? Well, simply looking at a map, that delta actually just hooks right up into the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And there's nothing stopping all the Caucasians in the Middle East from going around there. And so there's a lot of influxes in and out, but yet the Egyptians seem to be pretty much a constant all the way through, and this genetic study shows it and they reveal it. And if that doesn't quit dinging, I'm going to get pissed. Egypt has been thought of by many as a quintessential African civilization. There is, however, evidence that the ancient Egyptians may have been less African than modern Egyptians, at least genetically. And by the word African in this context, we're not saying endemic Caucasian North Africans, which the word Africa is named after. We're speaking of sub-Saharan Negroids and Nilotics and stuff of the time, like the Nubians, which really aren't related to the other guys, and the Khoisan, which really aren't related to any of these, but changes and stuff. And of course, they've shown a lot of admix lately in genetics, and all of those outlying Negroid populations, and it's the reason they have such a different phenotype than, say, West Africans and so on of the slave trade. So less African genetically, but then again, what is African genetics? Well, North African Libyans and so on is an African genetic. And some have definitely shown connections to Berbers, whether it's just through craniometry and some of the genetics that exist there too. But recent genetic studies have shown that the people of ancient Egypt had ties to ancient Near Eastern populations, such as the Armenians. And Herodotus makes note that he found right at the same area the Colchians. And he says they're the same as them. And, they have tan skin and curly hair. Everybody around here has that. That's nothing new. But what showed him is that they do their textiles exactly the same way, have rituals, and then they practice circumcision too, which is only between them and stuff. And it showed to be, somewhat unique, showing you that the Greeks didn't do it at the time, and a lot of the other people didn't at that time. And the biblical people do after, of course, and then most everybody does now, and it's seen as being a type of health and things, and a lot of times it's really just done out of somewhat of a ritual. So this is also is consistent with the idea of large migration out of the Middle East to settle parts of North Africa and Europe and mingle with populations in those areas. And of course, that would have been endemic Caucasians too, from way back when. And all their genetics shows that they have Neanderthal DNA and everything in them and so on. And some of them even higher than normal, including the Egyptians and all the ones that they found it in. But it does lead to the idea. Now, modern Egyptians have a lot of genetic and cultural ties to sub-Saharan Africa. And oh boy, hop up and down. Now, they're saying the modern Egyptians do, and that's due to the slave trade, from Islamic slave trade and things that happened that started 900 years before the Americas were even found, and that slave trade and so on. And they have admix all through them, and it's what makes them all darker toned and swarthy and stuff and everything, and you see the mix in them somewhat. Everybody's noted this and a lot of times. But it was the modern Egyptians that are that. What of the old Egyptians? Well, it has long been believed by archaeologists that the Egyptian civilization grew from villages developing along the Nile, which were similar people to farther south, and also being not Nubians or anything, but farther up the Nile than just the delta. So far, genetic studies of modern Egyptian as well as archaeological research have confirmed this. And so they're talking about, but not going into the fact that they found blonde and red-haired mummies and early statues that are blue-eyed. I'll show you some of those shortly and stuff. And of course, we know of Ginger, the blonde-haired, pale-skinned Badarian mummy. It's a pre-dynastic Ghibelline mummy that they have even in the British Museum itself right there, so it can show you some difference between them. But so far, genetic studies of modern Egyptians as well as archaeological research have confirmed this. Studies of the ancient Egyptian mummies, however, will tell a slightly more complex story. And a lot of people have tried to say, well, the upper Egyptians were black and the lowers what, and they were all mixed people and da-da-da, and make up all these things. But it shows definitely the opposite of that. In fact, if you go into their writings, they didn't have any contact till very early in the first dynasty with any Negroids at all, and those were Nubian, called the Nubian Ape colony, and they basically killed them all off and don't see any other contact or talking about them for over 400 years, and then shows up again. But they genetically and can tell that those people are slightly different, and that's what they ended up calling Nubian Sea Colony. Now, they're named Nubians because they're just out in the area that the Egyptians always ran and used to collect gold in, and that appears to go back to whenever it was even a Green Sahara. And I've done stories on the Green Sahara project, and there's another article that they've got here too that shows the wadis and oases out there and bodies that they have found now, and then those are Caucasians too and stuff. And the Green Sahara project itself and all of that type of thing. And there used to be riverlets running all the way through there that connected those oases, and they're just the last well pools of what people once were across North Africa, and the Sahara used to be green not too long ago, but a lot of people know that. So here's looking at a mummy and all wrapped up, and this is late kingdom because of all the artifacts, partially way of wrapping, and then the coloration looks onto him. It's at least in the middle. Doesn't say there. Checking the genes of Egyptian mummies. In a recent study, the genetic samples were taken from at least 90 mummies. Actually, it was over 100, but they got good, viable, knowing that they weren't contaminated in any way. 90 mummies, but only partial out of them. But they did get 3 they got the total genome out of. And I've done a few videos about this. 7P7's done one that goes way into it and deeper than I even will on this as far as genetics and things go. What geneticists working alongside archaeologists found is that the mummies had closer genetic connections to the Middle East, specifically the Levant and Anatolia. This is an interesting find since it suggests that modern Egyptians are more African than those ancient Egyptians were. Now he's just slowly milking you into the idea and being vague, like I said. But it suggests that modern Egyptians are a little more Negroid than perhaps the ancient Egyptians used to be, right? And craniometry and everything all the way through has always connected it to them. And so I've seen some black people try to refute that with saying, well, look at these Beja people that have somewhat similar phenotypes. And it's like, well, that's for admix, and those aren't related to the West African sub-Saharans. Are you in America? Are you an African-American Negro? Because that doesn't have anything to do with you. You didn't even know that Egypt existed. Then they get real mad and stuff. But that's another thing. And whenever I try to do a video that explains something like this, I get jumped on and told instantly that I'm some snow cave ape that they taught how to bathe, and crazy stuff that they racists have going on now. It's pretty disgusting, and by disgusting I mean, wow, yeah, really? But they've got themselves believing it, and they're all hopped up on it, causing their own racism by their own hands. But irregardless, let's look at this info here, because it doesn't matter what they think, it matters what reality is. One possible explanation for more genetic similarities between ancient Egyptians and Middle Eastern populations, such as Syrians or Armenians, would be the Hyksos. The Hyksos were a Middle Eastern people who occupied the Nile Delta sometime before 1650 and came to rule Egypt until they were ousted by a native dynasty later. This is one of the cartouches of that. I don't know which famous one it is. It's Apophis. And what's weird about Apophis is the name that they've given to an asteroid that's a near-Earth crossing asteroid, and it's supposed to have something to do with apocalypse and so on, and it's supposed to come with between us and a lot of our major satellites right here in a few years. And whenever it does so, they say now that if it goes through an exact window, that it will come back in 10 more years and hit us directly. So we'll have to do something definitely. I've seen what's going on, but I haven't heard anything on it lately. I'm surely trajectory changes slightly and they get really honed in on where this bullet's headed, but it's extremely close. And we've had some close calls here lately, and I do talk about cometary impacts and what caused the whole story of the Great Deluge and things like that, and then how that's in different waves, and kind of goes into it in this too, which is neat. We'll talk about. Now, this explanation fits well with the fact that it is mummified remains of Egyptian nobles and royalty who have the Middle Eastern lineage, although it's also true that commoners were typically not mummified, so we don't have the remains from which exact genetic materials and test the Hyksos hypothesis. That's not necessarily true, though, because they have found the necropolises that they have, and they're digging through some of those, and what ironically they found is redheads are buried in one area, blondes in another, separated from each other, and brown and black-haired people buried in another. And surely knowing that everybody in a family wasn't redhead and all these things going on, it shows you they may not have even buried them with similar family, but due to cultural beliefs and things they have going on, like Seti is known to have been a redhead as Seth in the Bible and stuff, and that hooks up to Typhon, and it's always called as a redhead. And we look at this common mythology that I keep talking about, and it goes right with it too. It makes just perfect sense. And of course, David was a redhead out of the Bible, and Solomon so and everything. But um, he says it fits well, though, although it's true that commoners were not typically mummified, but there were quite a bit. Now, they weren't run through the entire thing. They see some people that are high ups buried in little mastabas and little mound sets and down in the ground and stuff, but they don't see them done fancy. And then anything below that, the people are just buried out in the common graveyard. But in that common graveyard, they still got naturally desiccated pretty much from being inside the desert. And while many of them are ruined to the point that you don't see something that looks just like a mummy does in its preservation, a lot of them show their hair and different things, and they still have artifacts with them and little bangles and stuff, and all kinds of necklaces and earrings and stuff like that. In addition to many of them being Hyksos, it was thought there were probably intermarriages between the Hyksos and the native nobility. And before I read the next part, and I'll tell you, so that's what they were doing this for in the first place. They found this graveyard. It had mummies in it dating all the way back to before the Hyksos coming through, and then all the way through from then, which after would have been whenever Persians come in, and then we all know about later Greeks, the Akkadians, and then so on, and also talking about the 25th Cushitic dynasty that supposedly led some of the Nubian Negroids and made that part of that dynasty that only lasted, what, 70 or 92 years, depending on which dating time that you look at, and got all kicked out and everything, but then still called the illegitimate dynasty. And it looks like Egypt after that point really was just a subject to other people shortly after, and shadow of its former self, and then slowly went away from there. And it looks like people went to greener pastures, no pun intended, for what we're fixing to tell about. But one problem with this suggestion of the Hyksos is that most of the mummies tested date between 1380 BC and 425, well after the Hyksos were driven out of Egypt around 1550, although I believe there was a few of them, and even in the test they got genetics of that go before it. And so what I was saying a minute ago, what they were going to see is through time genetics changing, and because they saw some admix in some of them, they'd be, well, like, we've seen that, okay, that's Persian. Oh wow, okay, that's Akkadian. Okay, so here's the thing. Oh, and this guy got Persian and Akkadian. Oh, here's a half Greek. And see things like this. And the amazing part that they talk about in the paper is they saw really no genetic change whatsoever, and who they actually hook up to. And we're getting to that. Being somewhat subtle. No, I haven't been very subtle. Hell. One problem with that suggestion, though, is most of those mummies tested are supposedly around there, but they have others. It is possible that the course of the Egyptian pharaohs continued to be at least partly Hyksos lineage, even after the original Hyksos were expelled. People have tried to use that as an excuse to say, well, oh, there's so many Caucasians right in this area, and we can easily get their genetics than we can the other. So that that's how Caucasians are there, or that's how white people are there, or that's how more European-ish type and Anatolian people are there rather than the Middle Eastern or North African variation are there. But that's not true. And when they kicked the Hyksos out, it was a big thing. In fact, that's what equates to Exodus in the Bible. And some things about that, and how, like Yaqub, which is Jacob, because there was no J before the 1300s or so, but Yaqub Bal and Yaqub El are Hyksos rulers, along with the Sipophis and a few of the other ones that went through there in the dynasty that they had. But they were really just ruling pretty much the Delta area and co-ruling. And, well, you could, the Egyptians were perpetual, but what the Hyksos did bring them was they brought them horses, showing you that no, that wasn't the same people from right there. For horses come up with Proto-Indo-Europeans and Scythians and all those things. Those are the people that had horses. Everybody else had a donkey. Jesus rides in on a donkey. Abraham has a donkey. They all had donkeys. Then they get this war chariot situation. They get compound bows, a bunch of other things with warfare. philosophy and all these other things, and it actually helps make it through this time that we're talking about now until the 25th dynasty and shortly after collapsing. But let's continue. Now here's a picture that is shown a lot whenever Hyksos are mentioned onto it, and another in a minute will show some more of these guys. And you can see here that this is a pale Caucasian phenotype, King Tut, yet still drawn tanned rather than pale like the woman. But all those Egyptian nobility are kicking out all the Hyksos nobility, and they're all shown as pale and with blue and gold sashes on. Some of them striped linear around their body, but most of them lengthwise. And this depiction of riding over with chariots is real popular. They've got ones where it shows them going over Nubians. King Tut's is one is famous on his box. It shows him running over Nubian troglodytes, and they have the dogs attacking him and things and stuff. And he even had them on his shoes, sandals, and the Libyans too. And it's so he could crush them with every step, even into the afterlife. So he had no love for them at all. But at the same time, the Libyan that's in that picture too is a blonde-haired too, but they have that beard and that situation going on. But a Hyksos chariot painting, one of them, and that's out of a tomb from around the time now. Now there's a controversial connection. No, let's get vague and go again. One reason that this connection between ancient Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia might be controversial is that many Africans take pride in ancient Egypt being an African civilization. And no, it is an African civilization. It is in what we call Africa. The Caucasians named Africa, and they designate where it starts and ends, and continents and things. All these places are named for them. Egypt wasn't even called Egypt. That was named by Greeks. Those Caucasian Greeks name everything like Adam was supposed to in the Bible and everything. Those Adamic, pale, blushing people out of the Caucasian Bible. And so, in reality, what you have here is that shown evidently. But people have tried to make different equations out of it, and somehow secretly right there at the Nile Delta where Africa goes into the Middle East, that there'd be black people standing there waving at a borderline somehow, and the other side would have been Middle Easterns and Caucasian people. But that's not at all what it was. All of North Africa above the Sahara has always been Caucasians. Well documented, but they want to deny that because that'll ruin their narrative and all the other things. But funny, whenever you even look at the Egyptian art on the wall and they show the Libyans, they're pale guys with a side lock, they got tattoos on them. Egyptians have tattoos and everything. Ancient Scythians have tattoos. There's this cultural thing that's all hooked up. Sphinxes go with Greece and stuff. I've done videos on that recently. I've kind of slowly picked it apart, but it really doesn't take too much. All you have to do is show some of these early statues and all the way through. But some people would believe that you'd have to prove it genetically, and then after you prove that and show everything, then they still say, oh, DNA is a lie. It's all trying to keep down the black man. And it's like, seriously, dude. So it is an African civilization, but the people in there are what we think of when we say Africans today. No, but in reality, the Caucasians of North Africa, of course, African. They're not European. So, by the same account, these ancient Egyptians were African Caucasians. And that's what's been said all the way through. It's only now that it's been some controversy about it. And black people seems to think that there's a debate about it. Most of these debating it are people from the West African slave trade. And they didn't know Egypt existed. They were primitives, illiterate, just really. And so that just kind of looks pathetic to try to make that connection in any way. No one would ever even thought that had any connection, validity to it at all. But due to Diop and some other guys that have already been well debunked, they've come up with this. And even though it's been debunked now and they get shown this a lot, they still grip onto it, probably to an inferiority complex and having to be around the people that are actually from this point on go and turn into the leaders of mankind and humanity, and now they can fly and they're spacemen. Meanwhile, back in Africa, they're, you know, in non-westernized areas, they are not doing much anything different. Oh, there's lots of videos, you know, modern videos of still very primitive sub-Saharan Africans, and some of those are wanting to make the claim that they weren't West African primitives, they were East African Caucasians. But that's a little different than the reality. The suggestion might have had more ties to the Middle East might appear to some, once again, to deny the virtues of African civilizations by saying that the ancient Egyptian was either Middle Eastern civilization or not truly African. But that's not true. It's truly African, the North African Caucasians. And everybody knows that, except for a certain people, and of course they're the ones trying to make this claim, while the rest of the world kind of goes, yeah, but you were no, but they like to try it. Of course, even if this is true and ancient Egypt was more Middle Eastern than African, Africa still has many unambiguously indigenous civilizations, including Mali, which was started by a Caucasian named Queen Tinhanen, and I've done a video about it, and it shows and everything. Some black guy challenged me, by the way, y'all, and said all this stuff and everything, and I'm like, well, no, okay, let me show you. Then he says, Great Zimbabwe, and yeah, the local Shoney people there have told a long time ago, people, that there was white people that came, named the Maiti, like apparently the Phoenicians in some way came in and built that. Aksum is in North Horn of Africa region off on the edge there, and all that area is attributed again to ancient Caucasians, and the admix there of the people shows you kind of the difference of those people. But no Negroid population has ever done great stonework, much less made something that looks like a big obelisk like this in any way. And so that's easily seen, just like Great Zimbabwe. It's like, okay, well, they did that. Is there anything before? Because this is hooked together stonework without mortar, and it's done in that way that all these others are over here that are definitely not Negroid, but this one is supposed to be Negroid. Okay, so where's another? Oh, there's not. Then they start pointing out, oh, well, up in Moreau, they've got all the pyramids there, and well, they're little bitty pyramids, and they're actually not done on sacred things, but at the same time, that area was started by Ramses II and stuff, and they had governance up there and so on, and Moreau is actually a Persian Cambyses' sister's name, and they named it after her. Yeah, and the Candace that they keep trying to talk about as the queen, Candace is a Persian queen's name. Kandake or Candace, whichever way you want to look at it. So, of course, even if this is true and ancient Egypt was more Middle Eastern than Africa, you have those in Aksum you talked about. Well, Swahili city-states, Benin, just to name a few. Benin's only claim is that somehow out of nowhere they have these masks, and clearly people have said they must have had help because there's no predecessor again and something happened. So some people had trade with them and they could make these badass masks, and they helped to make it with them and showed them how to do it, because they don't have a Copper Age and a Bronze Age and come up. There's one other African population that just shows up with Bronze Age all of a sudden. It's like, no, that's brought to them because they didn't do it on their own. The iron isn't from around there. But Middle Eastern influence we're talking about. Interestingly, this evidence may hint at a larger pattern that suggests a great movement of people out of the Middle East beginning in the Neolithic times. And I've shown this in a lot of my videos in this ancient migration and stuff that happened. One from a great drought long, long ago, and it's recorded in the Greeks and everything, you know. So that it affected a lot of people. Later, another one happened, and that pretty much sealed the Trojan War that we all are famously know about, and used to think that was probably just a myth too, but no, that's been found. And up in Anatolian Troy and so on, in these ancient people. And then there's, of course, that was while this land was starving out, and then trying to come back starving out and turning into a desert. There used to be great tree forest here in that area, and it could hold itself, but it kind of did a Dust Bowl, Oklahoma, and dehydrated out and turned to crap, just like the Green Sahara did. Right? So in 2016, genetic evidence was found that Europeans are at least partially descended from farmers who had migrated into Europe from Anatolia perhaps 8,000 years ago. And we've been talking about the people of Göbekli Tepe, right, and Catalhoyuk, and the civilizations that come out of that, and then come down into Canaanite areas, and the influx and the double influx of people that kind of build up this culture. And if you look at it in a religion way, it overlaps and overlaps and expounds. There's a whole lot of it, though, that's not even being talked about in any of this situation usually, and that's Sumeria. And that's where a lot of this began. In fact, it predates a lot of it happening. In fact, these Anatolian farmers they talk about are also, you go up the river from Sumeria, that's where you run right into Tigris and Euphrates, biblical stories, so on. So it is possible that just as farmers migrated from the Middle East into Europe, they may have also migrated into Egypt and mingled with the native African populations to create the Egyptian culture. And yes, this would have been endemic Caucasian North Africans getting, again, like what happened with the Hyksos, but at a much, much earlier time, coming down and going around North Africa and bleeding into it there. But then they became city-states fairly rapidly from already having the concept of being the people from up north, and they pulled it together. But then North and South Egypt wasn't really into one yet. It's in what we call the first dynasty. So everything's Dynasty Zero, and before that, Naqada periods and all these. But it goes back thousands of years of these people being there and this influx they have. And you can definitely see that right before it kicks off, there appears to be another Sumerian influx. And there's Sumerian cylinder seals that go with it, and symbolism, and with a Gebel Arak knife with Master of the Beast and all these things, and iconography you can see in Sumerians and them. And of course, there's this animalistic thing that really takes off and holds strong through Egypt, where there's all the animal-headed people and stuff, and we can find that going back till Cro-Magnon Neanderthal caveman times with the lion-headed creature. But that's neither here nor there. Let's continue. It's possible that just as farmers migrated from the Middle East into Europe, they've also migrated down there. And yeah, Middle Eastern influence on the Nile Valley is supported by the fact of Middle Eastern domesticates such as wheat, barley, sheep, and goats were all prevalent in ancient Egypt. And what he doesn't finish it off with is now genetics have proven a long time ago that all of that, cattle, Botaurus, and all that goes along with that, along with the grains and so on, match grains in Sumer and Upper Anatolia, where they were domesticated themselves and got going in a whole lot more domestication to where they could grow a whole lot more stronger and produce a whole lot more. Like what they say, corn came from this little thing that turned into, now we got big old corns. Manipulation that's been done like that in ancient times, early farmers getting it going on better and better and better. And this is seen with this tree of life situation sometimes in a conceptual idea of gardeners gardening. And the Bible starts in a garden of Eden, right? But their grains definitely come from there. And so that shows an influx. Well, it could have just been not influx, it could have just been early trade and things back and forth, and then they got it going. That's all it would take. Right, but no, it shows no, that's not exactly what happened. Then you see wall stuff like this, and then there's, I don't know if there's going to be any pale women in here, but this, they only had a simple palette. Red ochre, a slight tan color, like you see in the background off there. And so they give contrast in colors. And workers and farmers like this, and these people that are planting right here, are going to be tanned, just like rednecks. Yeah, and I don't get out in the sun, and hopefully that shows up this time. I do this all the time, but I'm dark as cardboard. And I stay that way. Somehow blacks want to, in their mind, believe that white people are as white as this paper here, or some kind of albino or thing. And oh, I've even heard that we were actually just albino Negroes. Yeah, it's really gotten bad, especially here in America. But I hear it's going on all over Europe too, with Akala and his thing. But I made a debunk of that, and uh, Seven Phoenician Seven made an incredible series of them, where pretty much everything out of his mouth was a lie. And then, of course, if you cut that premise off that he tries to go with, everything after that makes no difference, or at least it doesn't to black people, Negroids. But yeah, so pale women. Oh, blonde haired's up there above, though. Redheads here. Pale women. What's up with that? And all this ancient farming that goes on, and that's a very dark and tight picture. And there's a lot more that give more lighter and darker and so on. And I don't know, that hasn't been contrasted a little to make it look better, but because I can show you a lot more, and I will in a minute here. Hopefully, if this doesn't cut off. If it cuts off in the top left-hand corner, it'll go to part 2, but I'm trying to get through this here and show you more, and maybe it'll cut off in the pictures I show and just fade away. It's possible that in addition to technologies and ideas, there was also a movement of people from the Middle East into the Nile Valley, and although this Middle Eastern genetic influence might be mainly restricted to Egyptian nobility, this genetic pattern could also be evidence of a hypothetical migration from the Near East during the Neolithic. And I've also had black people now say, well, the Egyptians were blacks, but then all the kings and nobility, I guess, were light, and all the women. And it's like, well, no, it doesn't work that way, too. And none of them are sub-Saharan Negroids, and none of them are West African primitives, or even related to them, and they didn't know it existed. And then they get real mad again, and it's like, come on, be realistic. Stop. You're causing your own problem. Seek help. Other implications of this. A movement of people out of the Anatolia and Levant area into Africa and Europe, both ways, has implications for the ancient Near Eastern traditions, which teach that humanity originated from the Middle East, like in the Bible and a lot of other stories. The most well-known tradition is taught is that this would be the Judeo-Christian tradition, and though Islam also believes this and started a later thing that works off the exact same thing, they just said they had a prophet that showed up for them later, that had a flying horse and stuff, and married a little girl. In the Bible, the descendants of Noah settled the world known to the ancient Hebrews after the flood, and this is Mount Ararat, and people say, well, that's up in the Caucasus Mountains. So the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Mediterranean were the areas that it said that he was supposed to have repopulated. If you look at simple definitions, Hamites are a division of the Caucasian race, Shemites, and Japhethites. Well, Japhethites are northern, Middle Eastern, and all around the Mediterranean. And they aren't different people and didn't turn into different people. They're all still the same people. They have the same genetics. And it isn't that one of them's blonde, so he has blonde kids. No. If all of them have that, they have the blonde trait. And they could have brown-haired too in a row, and then all of a sudden have blonde-haired kids. They have that trait. And you could gear for it and try to make it stronger. But like Esau, he's shown to be a redhead, just like David and Solomon and everything too. And so black people see that when they're trying to claim the Bible and not Egypt. And they say, well, then Jacob was black. And it's like, no, neither one of them. They're twins. Nobody in the Caucasian Bible, it's not a story about the world and everybody else. It doesn't mention Eskimos, and it doesn't mention Negroes. It doesn't mention Oriental people, and it doesn't mention Negroes. It doesn't mention tropical islanders, and it doesn't mention Negroes. It doesn't mention Amerindians, and it doesn't mention Negroes, but it does mention all these Caucasians. Well, it mentions Egypt and all these, yeah, and that's Caucasians. Even Ethiopia of the Greeks and what they defined it on and made up the word about, it's talked about suntan and sunburnt faces. It does not talk about Negroes. Now later, even the area we call Ethiopia today is 40 to 50% admixed people, but that area was called Abyssinia. If you look up the definition, and I've done a video on it, and I have in a couple of other videos because they keep saying this stuff, And it shows all the places that the Greeks in their stories talked about as being Ethiopians. And if you look, it's all at the end of river valleys, and it's farmers again, just like these Egyptians. Oh, and them Greeks, yeah, they got that red ochre and light women and everything, just like the Egyptians. Yeah, and they never refer to them as anything but. But again, let's go on. In the Bible, the descendants of Noah settled the world known to the ancient Hebrews after the flood, the Middle East, North Africa, and Eastern Mediterranean, known as the known world to that time. The ancient Hebrews believed that all nations known to them, the Greeks and Assyrians, the Egyptians, and the Hittites, among others, descended from Noah and his sons all the way through, and the 12 tribes were always all these Caucasian people, tribes, Scythians, and all those. Yeah. hmm And here's a picture of that, Noah and the flood and everything. And we could go into the concepts of that's really just an allegory for a lot of concepts. But sorry, defense of the reality of the flood of Noah, even a local one, which only flooded the Mesopotamian or Sumerian floodplain, is a subject for a different article. But a question that can be considered in this article is whether there is evidence for the idea that the Mediterranean and ancient Near Eastern worlds were settled by full or partial descendants of a figure like Noah. And yes, it is. All the way into India, and the ancient people called Aryans, and the Persians were called Aryans in ancient times, and Herodotus say that, and he says the Medes were called Aryans in ancient times, till Media came from Athens and they changed their name. So people were all in that area called Aryans at one time and stuff. So then they give other names for regional things going on, like Scythians and so on else, but those are all still the same people, and that's those Proto-Indo-Europeans. For we have to say that now. Aryan's bad because of something Hitler did, but that swastika is in all kinds of religions and all over the entire planet, and it didn't have anything to do for a build-up for him in any way, shape, or form, though it seemed that he felt like it did, and I'm not going to go into the pros and cons of that type of situation. Both ancient Egypt and Europe appear to have genetic ties to Anatolia and Proto-Indo-Europeans, while ancient Egypt also has genetic ties to the Levant, according to current findings. Anatolia and the Levant are both proposed regions from where Noah's descendants are said to have set out and repopulate the earth. The fact that this genetic connection to Anatolia and Levant exists for populations in Europe and North Africa, specifically Egypt, does not by itself prove that modern Europeans or ancient Egyptians were descended from survivors of a great flood, which devastated those parts of the Middle East. It is, however, consistent with the idea. Let's go with another viewpoint onto it. This ancient flood story, I've done a video about this recently, where it talks about all of them and how they are connected, and they all have this common story. All the way back from coming out of the last ice age to the Black Sea region flooding over, and the people that we know were around there, and these ancient Scythians and Sarmatians and stuff, and then there where they migrate to, these people have a flood story, slightly variation on a theme. Then you have it in Mesopotamia, but then they're all living off these giant river systems that occasionally flood, and that just makes sense. And so people have said, well, is it all localized floods from different people, or is it this one big flood that these people had? Well, the sad answer is yes. For the people going around bringing humanity to everybody and stuff and helping out had this story. But then Sumeria, where the Bible's from and where we're trying to project it to as we're talking about this, is about a localized flood that all the way through Samaria was done. But everywhere else had other floods, and then we talk about Atlantis and the land leaving in a flood and all these type of situations, and there are many flood stories all the way around the planet, right? So here we see what are the Hyksos come in to the Egyptians. I'd like to mention now, in just a recent video I did, I showed a black guy trying to show this, and it showed where you Negro shop a picture for, he made these Egyptians black right here, and the Hyksos here dark, as the Egyptians are even darker now. Of course, this is supposed to be their nobility, and they are not picturing them with the symbolic thing, and so their women and their men are the exact